Well, good Sunday morning to you on May the 17th as we take a look this morning at our Sunday school lesson out of the D6 Fusion material. And we've hoped that as we've had some of these discussions with family, sitting around a table, or also when we've just stood before you and kind of talked through the questions, we hope that they've inspired you in some way to sit down with your family and listen to a discussion, or have a discussion, I should say, concerning God's Word. And maybe you ask questions along the way from each other just to figure out exactly what God's trying to teach you through this. As always, if you have any questions, we'd be glad to visit with you about it. But we're going to look today out of the D6 Fusion lesson, and the theme about it is who was Cain's wife? And this whole age-old question kind of comes about of if Adam and Eve were the first two individuals on the face of the earth, and we know they were, and they had two sons, Cain and Abel, and Cain kills Abel, then where does Cain's wife come from? And so we want to look today with that kind of thinking along those lines and answering that question. So Genesis chapter 4 is where we want to take our text, and verses 1 through 17. It says, "Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock, and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. And the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground, and now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Then the Lord said to him, Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And when he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Now, looking, and we had posted questions on Facebook, and hopefully we'll get them on a text message as well. But if you haven't got them, please let me know, and we'll get those to you. But we're going to walk through those, and a couple other passages of Scripture we'll reference as well. But I want to first look at this question, who was the first human born under the curse of sin? And we think about, because sin is such a part of our life today, and there's no one today that's born out from under this curse of sin. So we often sometimes forget that the first human that was born under the curse of sin was not Adam and Eve, but it was actually Cain himself, and then secondly his brother Abel. And second question was, how did Cain and Abel know about the importance of sacrificial offerings? Well, if you go back, Cain and Abel had to be taught by someone. Adam and Eve being their mother and father, then you find that Adam and Eve must have instilled in Cain and Abel, either as they watched their mom and dad do these offerings, or either their mom and dad taught them that these offerings were important to give unto God, as we today need to do the same thing and teach the next generation that giving to God, giving to others is an important part of who we are as a believer, as a Christian. Third question, what was the difference between the two offerings? We find, as we read, that in verse 3, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. Now, sometimes people look at Old Testament and they say, well, God prescribed that it should be animal offerings. Well, first off, that wasn't until much later. And secondly, God also provided that grain offerings were a part of what was sacrificially given unto him. So we find that it's not because one gave grain and one gave animal that one was accepted and the other was not. What we find is that there was a heart situation going on, and we find this still today. And if not cautious, then we can have a heart like Cain's. Abel had a heart that was not grudgingly giving to God. He had a heart that was openly giving. But Cain had a heart that was apparently somewhat grudgingly giving to God. And so God accepted Abel's because Abel gave in the right attitude, the right spirit, we might say. He gave because he wanted to, because he was blessed by God. He wanted to give back to God. Cain didn't necessarily give in that way. We have to be cautious today that we don't find ourselves in that same situation. When we give to God or give to another individual, when we just in generosity give, we should do it not expecting anything in return, and also do it out of the goodness of our heart because we care and we love that individual. Now, we find this in many different ways, and sometimes decisions we make show our love and our care for other people. Fourth question that we have is, where did Cain go after God confronted him about killing Abel? And he went into the land of Nod, which we don't know a whole lot about. We know he went there, and apparently there was other people. Whether he was married before he went there or not, we don't really know. But we find that in verse 17, Cain knew his wife, and they bore the son Enoch. So there were other people on the face of the earth at this point in time. What do we know about Cain's wife? Question 5. We really don't know too much. We're not told what her name is here. We're not told where she came from. We're just told that he knew his wife. And so we don't know too much about her. Question 6, at this point, did Cain have other brothers and sisters? And the answer is yes. Now you might say, well, how do we know that? And one of the reasons that we know that, it's not the only one, but one of them is, if we go back to verse 14, and in verse 14, Cain is responding to God, and he says, "Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden." Then notice this sentence, "I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." Now, if there's Adam, Eve, and Cain, then who else is there to find him? And we know Seth came along as the individual that somewhat took Abel's place, but we do find that Cain has a concern that other people will actually kill him. And so from that, we can say that there had to be other brothers and sisters that Cain would have had at this point in time. Also, the fact that Cain is marrying a wife, and it lets us know that there had to be other brothers and sisters that Cain would have had. Now, it's possible that Cain could have married a sister, and we think of that as being somewhat gross today, but it's also possible that Cain could have married a niece, or he could have married a granddaughter. Keep in mind, Adam lived over 900 years. Now, it's possible that they had a ton of children during that time. We don't know. God tells them to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. So we don't know how many children exactly that they had. But they could have had them over a course of time to where if Cain, let's just say that Adam and Eve, just for instance, Adam and Eve had Cain when they were 25. They could have had a daughter at the age of 65, which would have been 40 years later. Cain would have been 40 years old. By the time the daughter turned 20, Cain could have married her. Cain would have been 60. The daughter would have been 20. Might not have been too out of line at that point in time, because you got to remember, they're living to 800, 900 years. They're not living to 75 years and that their lifespan being over. Much different time that we're talking about then. Now, in question 7, what does Genesis chapter 5, verse 4 tell us about where Cain's wife came from? And if you look in Genesis chapter 5, verse 4, it says, the days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. So he lived 930 years. After he fathered Seth, the days of Adam after he fathered Seth was 800 years. So apparently, Adam was 130 years old when he had Seth. Now, we struggle with thinking if we're like 45 or 50 of having a newborn child and having the energy to take care of them. But understand, he was 130 and he's having the energy to do this. So just a total different setting in that point in time prior to the flood. And we find that after the flood, things really change here on earth. So we know that Cain had other brothers and sisters, that Cain's wife could have been a sister to him. Keep in mind that Abraham, even much later, Abraham marries his stepsister, if I remember that right. And so we find that Jacob actually marries his family as well. So this happens. And not until till the Israelites leave Egypt and God gives Moses the law over in Leviticus that we'll look at in a moment, does God prescribe that this should not occur. So question 8, what did God declare in Genesis chapter 1 verse 31, and what would this include? So chapter 1 verse 31, the creation chapter, and in verse 31, God looks at everything that he's created and he says, and God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning the sixth day. God pronounced everything that he had created as being very good at that point. Now that also included humanity. Humanity was created. There are just a few verses above that in verse 26. And he says, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion. And so we find that God blesses them, and God had created them, and then he rests on the seventh day. But God pronounces there in verse 31, he pronounces that everything he's created was good. Now, what all would that include? So that would include, to break this down into some, you might say scientific thoughts about it, but it would include the DNA of man would have been very good. God created that. Now, not only the DNA, but the individual. So, question 9, how was God's instruction through Moses in Leviticus 18, 6 through 9, a protection for all people? And this kind of piggybacks off the question we just had. In Leviticus chapter 18, in verses 6 through 9, this is God prescribing to Moses what the law should be. It says, none of you shall approach any one of his close relatives to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's daughter, whether brought up in the family or in another home. Now, God, at this point in time, makes it morally wrong for individuals to marry or to have relations with a brother, sister, or anyone of that type of relationship. Now, we might say, why is God doing this, and why is this a protection for all people? So, what we know scientifically is that Adam and Eve, God pronounced them very good. Because of the curse of sin, though, things started happening in our bodies that were not good. And so this DNA structure that we have, what we find that over a course of time is that DNA structure there will be mutations that come from that. And as these mutations occur, that mutation then is transferred to the next generation. So if you have a brother and sister have the same mutation because it's been transferred from mother and father to them, if brother and sister now marry, you have that same mutation that is happening again, which then causes additional mutations to occur. And so we find that in today's world we see this evident in birth defects that occur. But God prescribing this was to prevent this major outbreak of birth defects to occur, because by the time they get to this point in time, the DNA structure had mutations that were in it. People had lived long enough from Adam and Eve for those things to occur, and so God tells them that it is wrong. It also created diversity within the genetic code to where we might look at things such as infectious disease, and we find that certain individuals have a resistance to that as you diversify, or if you did not diversify, and if brother and sister married each other, then the only immunity they're going to have is from mom and dad, or what they've been around. And so as a individual marries someone from another family, then you have that immunity that then passes on from both sets to the next generation. So, last question, why was Cain's marrying his sister or niece not a biological problem? And at that point, as we've said, the genetic code was good. God had said everything that he created was good. Now, we don't know when those mutations would have started. We don't know what generation it would have happened in. But God had not given the instruction until Leviticus. So we know that's several hundred years, several generations now until that point. And so God gave that instruction. And from that point forward, morally, it was wrong. Now, can it occur and not be a birth defect of some kind? Possibly. But at the same time, God's word says that it is wrong to do. And therefore, we go by that. But who was Cain's wife? So thinking of that question, Cain's wife had to be a relative of his. Brother, sister, niece, it wouldn't be a brother, sorry. A sister to Cain, or a niece to Cain, or a granddaughter to Cain. Would have had to have been. Now, we're not told necessarily how quickly they had children. You know, was it at the age of 20? Was it the age of 40? We don't know. But we know that Adam was still having children at 130. And that would have put Eve at 130 as well. So at that point in time, we find that they were still able to bear children then. Cain's wife had to be a relative of his. Wasn't wrong at that point in time because God had not said it was wrong. Plus, the genetic code was very good. It was good when God created it. Mutations started happening sometime later because of the curse of sin. And then we find that God says in that Leviticus passage that this should not happen. And that was to protect people from all of this birth defect issue that we know can occur. We hope you have a great rest of your Sunday or whatever day you may be watching this. And if you have questions about what we look at or study, please give me a call. We'd be glad to visit with you about them or text me. Hope to see you before long, and God bless.